So good evening, everyone. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. Welcome to the 12th webinar of the series Biodiversity Conversations, India's Opportunities and Challenges. So these webinars focus on various aspects of the national mission on biodiversity and human well-being. And it's a webinar series that's co-organized by the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, the National Biodiversity Authority, and the Biodiversity Collective. My name is Mahesh Shankaran. I'm an ecologist and I work at the National Center for Biological Sciences, Bangalore, and I will be moderating today's session. And the topic for today's discussion is climate change adaptation, mitigation, and disaster resilience, emerging and future challenges for India's ecosystems. We have an excellent set of speakers on our panel today. We have Dr. Jagdish Krishnaswamy from A3 Bangalore, Professor Raman Sukumar from the Center for Ecological Sciences, IISc Bangalore, Dr. Deepak Barwa from the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, IISER Pune, and Dr. Dhananjay Mohan, who is the current director of the Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun. Unfortunately, one of the speakers was scheduled to be a part of this panel, Dr. Roxy Matthew Cole from the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, will not be joining us today due to some last-minute unavoidable circumstances. He was going to talk about the effects of climate change on the Indian monsoon. So unfortunately, his absence today means that we will not be having that perspective in today's discussion. So before I go ahead and introduce the panel in some bit of detail, I have a few housekeeping announcements that I would like to make. At this point, I also request that you open your chat box as all the details will be sent there. Right? So we've already received some questions by email, but we welcome additional questions during the course of this webinar. Please use the Q&A facility to ask questions of the panelists. Also, if you have any comments or suggestions on the national mission, please also do share this with us today. So we'll try and answer as many questions as we can within the time frame that we have today. But in case we are unable to answer all the questions, these will be answered via email. And you can also get in touch with us at contact@biodiversitycollaborative.org. Right? If you prefer, you can ask your questions anonymously, but we encourage all of you to include your email ID. So that is when you send your questions in, to enable us to respond to you later in case we don't get to your question during the webinar. A few other points I'd like to make. This webinar is also being streamed live on our Facebook page, Biodiversity Collective, and a recording of the webinar will be uploaded soon on our YouTube channel, also called Biodiversity Collective. The channel also has recordings for the previous webinars, and you can find the link to these in the chat box. And I would strongly recommend or encourage you to go ahead and view these earlier webinars too. During this webinar, the chat function will be disabled. Please also do not use the raise your hand function. We request you to only use the Q&A function to send in your questions. And finally, at this point, I would also like to gratefully acknowledge the support we have received from the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India for allowing us to conduct these webinars. And finally, in case there are any disruptions due to poor connectivity or power shutdown, we request all of you to please bear with us and be patient, and we'll do our best to restore and resume quickly. If one of the speakers has issues with connectivity, then what I'm going to do as a moderator is switch to another speaker in the interest of time, and then come back once the connectivity issues have been sorted out. Hopefully, however, it's not going to come to this. So in terms of the structure of the webinar, we have 4 panelists. We'll have them speak first for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll open up the floor to discussions and the Q&A. And as I mentioned, we have a very diverse and exciting set of panelists today. I'll introduce them just before they are going to start speaking. We'll start off with our first speaker, who's Dr. Jagdish Krishnaswamy. He's an eco-hydrologist and a landscape ecologist who has worked extensively on the effects of land use and climate change on hydrological and other processes in various ecosystems across the country. He's a senior fellow at A3 Bangalore. And what Jagdish will do is start off by providing us with a broad overview of the climate change and disaster risk mitigation of the National Mission on Biodiversity and Human Wellbeing. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Jagdish.
Thanks, Mahesh. I'll just load my presentation. So this is just to introduce one of the components of the National Mission for Biodiversity and Human Wellbeing, which is on biodiversity, climate change, and disaster risk management. As we have been seeing through the series, biodiversity has connections with various aspects of human well-being. And the part that we will be looking at today is the role that biodiversity plays in both responding to climate change as well as helping us cope with climate change, which is the biodiversity, climate change, and disaster risk management. So even as climate change impacts biodiversity, well-functioning and restored ecosystems can help cope with climate change. And that's basically illustrated in the icon that has been designed for this particular component, where you can see that even as climate change and extreme weather events, climate shocks can impact biodiversity, biodiversity also provides an umbrella in providing resilience to human and natural systems to cope with these perturbations. So this is some of the thinking that contributed to our work. So this is the work of Jaya Khanna, who initially studied the impacts of vegetation change in Amazonia on the climate in the Amazon basin. And she has brought that thinking into our mission because the role of vegetation in places such as the Western Ghats, the Himalayas, or the Central Indian Highlands on monsoon is very poorly studied. Even though recently there's some work from IIT Bombay which suggests that the evapotranspiration from the forests of the Western Ghats is a significant source of moisture for the monsoon that falls in parts of Tamil Nadu. So that is a knowledge gap that has been identified. Similarly, here is Dawn Sebastian, who was part of our consultation on climate change in Bengaluru. And her work has shown how different types of forests in India have very different types of limiting variables in terms of either being limited by moisture or by radiation. And particularly as an example, the broadleaf forests in the Western Himalayas are very sensitive to the rainfall that happens post-monsoon. So these winter disturbances, the westerlies, typically during January and February, have a very big impact on the productivity of the forests in the Western Himalayas. And this, what happens to the post-monsoon rainfall or winter rainfall under future climate change is going to be a major factor in terms of the biodiversity as well as the ecosystem services of the Western Himalayan forests. And of course, Saudamani Das's very critical work on the impact of the super cyclone in Odisha and how mangrove forests provided shelter to many villages, and in fact demonstrated quantitatively that the death toll due to the cyclone was potentially reduced in areas which had a protective cover of mangroves. So this shows the other side of the climate change biodiversity linkages, as how well-functioning and protected ecosystems can provide resilience against future climatic shocks and perturbations. So we have in this component, through all our consultations and inputs from a wide range of scholars, recognize that we really need a comprehensive assessment of the impact of climate change on ecosystems, as well as the role of well-functioning and restored ecosystems under a future climate, because a major initiative of both the government as well as civil society is the restoration of degraded areas throughout the country. And this information is really critical for land use planning, as well as managing and conserving India's biodiversity under climate change. So what will we do under this component in order to address these challenges? So the program objectives basically is a national participation through core activities as well as competitive grants for multidisciplinary and diverse consortium, which will consist of academics, stakeholders, entrepreneurs, and other members of civil society. And to be more specific, we hope to quantify and map key risks to biodiversity and ecosystem services from climate change, also assess the role of biodiversity and ecosystem functions in disaster risk mitigation using available information and historical responses, and use this information to enable planning of India's ecological restoration with multiple ecosystem services with climate change mitigation and adaptation core benefits. And that is the key emphasis is on having multiple ecosystem services being generated rather than only being carbon centric. And we hope to do this by facilitating climate change informed ecosystem restoration entrepreneurships, which we hope will be a major part of the effort for restoring many of India's degraded ecosystems. This is just an example, one from the Western Ghats, the top left panel, that shows a landslide that ripped through the Nilgiris, through the Shola forests just in the last monsoon. And the photo below is from just a couple of days ago from a landslide in the Himalayas. So the Nilgiris photo is by Farrell, who have been observing these systems, and we have a set of instrumented long-term sites there. And the site in Uttarakhand is a very recent landslide. So we hope that even as climate change is going to be impacting ecosystems, we are hopeful that what we see on the extreme right, which is a well-functioning ecosystems of high elevation grasslands and Shola forests in the Western Ghats, can continue to provide us with ecosystem services even under a future climate. So that's where I'm going to end, and I'm going to end with this nice icon, which basically brings out both dimensions of the climate change biodiversity linkage. Thank you. Mahesh, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks, Jagdish. Thanks for that overview of the climate change and disaster risk mitigation component of the national mission, which sort of provides a broad overview of what the mission is all about. And with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to our next speaker, who's Professor Raman Sukumar from the Center for Ecological Sciences, IISc Bangalore. I'm sure most of you are familiar with him and his work on the ecology of the Asiatic elephant. But Dr. Sukumar also has one of the longest running research programs in the country on tropical forest ecology and dynamics. These are a set of long-term vegetation monitoring plots that have been set up in Mudumalai and which have given us critical insights into the long-term functioning of these ecosystems. And today he's going to be giving us his perspective on the response and resilience of Indian ecosystems to climate change. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Professor Sukumar.
Thank you, Mahesh, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm out in the field, so I hope that you will be able to hear me clearly enough. I lost connection for a few minutes and I missed a part of Jagdish's talk, but I'll try to, I think the last slide I caught up with, so I think I understood the gist of what Jagdish was trying to say. I really hope that the biodiversity conversations that Mahesh referred to will eventually translate in our country into meaningful conservation. And I'm stating this because almost 30 years ago, I remember being a participant in a wildlife conservation seminar in which the chief guest kept referring to wildlife conservation as wildlife conversation, throughout the speech. So I hope that we'll be able to really translate that into meaningful conservation, from conversation to conversation. But I think conversations are extremely important. And, very often we think we know what we should do, but very often we do not, Given just the 10 minutes that we have, I'm not going to upload any presentation or anything of the sort, but essentially run through certain ideas that I've been trying to, in the last several years, trying to pursue at the policy level with the government. Okay. And I hope that the Biodiversity Collaborative will eventually be able to clinch some of this in terms of how we move towards a more inclusive and more meaningful conservation that is not focused only on the tiger or the elephant. And I'm saying this because, the elephant is my pet species, but will encompass the whole of biodiversity, and also, pay adequate attention to the needs of people in a country where, people's dependence on biomass is so huge that we just cannot ignore this at all. Now, over the years, I have been contributing to IPC for almost 3 decades now. And the early years, when we spoke about forests or whatever, the main aim of the utility of forests was seen as mitigation of climate change. So, forests are there to soak up all the carbon that, the major, GHG emitters are put out into the atmosphere. It doesn't matter, you go to developing countries, you grow more forests and you soak up. So we kind of became the garbage pit of the major emitters of this world. But then over a period of time, I think the adaptation story narrative has gained strength, because it's increasingly realized that in developing countries, the real issue is not so much a mitigation, but what is that to mitigate when carbon emissions per capita are so extremely low in most of these countries? You go to Africa. I mean, what is the contribution of the whole of the African continent to climate change? Is very, very little. And therefore, but Africa will have to adapt to climate change because of the huge impacts that climate change will make on the biodiversity of the continent of Africa and many other places, including India. Now, one of the challenges that we face when trying to design biodiversity conservation plans is what is going to be the nature of climate change in a given region or a subcontinent or whatever at that scale, right? I think Mahesh mentioned that one of the speakers who was supposed to speak about climate change impacts on India is missing, is not being able to join. So I'll just take 1 minute to try to fill in that gap. The temperature across India is going to change in tune with global change in temperatures, period. It is going to be greater in the northern part of the country compared to the southern part of the country. And my simplistic understanding of this is the peninsula is more buffered by the oceanic influence. You have the Arabian Sea, you have the Bay of Bengal, and you have the Indian Ocean. Just slightly better buffered. Okay, so the northern part of the country, especially the northwest of the country, the temperatures are going to rise much more than what they're going to in the south, maybe 2 or 3 degrees greater, but uniformly increasing temperature. The big challenge for India and for the Indian monsoon has really been a good understanding or a robust understanding of how the monsoon is going to change. Okay, if you look at the earlier models, some models said that monsoon will increase all over the country. Some models said that monsoon will decline all over the country because you had aerosols that India and China is putting out, and those aerosols are going to cause global cooling, local cooling, and so on and so forth. We still don't have a robust understanding, but the models have gotten better over time. I'm not going to get into details of those models, but there are going to be winners and losers. By winners, I mean there is going to be increased rainfall in certain regions of the country. There's certainly going to be decreased rainfall in other parts of the country. So you really need to look at a regional scale. You need to look at a combination of temperature increasing or decreasing, rainfall increasing or decreasing, plus other parameters that are there. Okay, and then try to plan our conservation strategies. Now, in this context, yesterday Mahesh and I were in a IPBES IPCC handshake workshop, and there have been calls when it comes to conservation. See, many of you all would have heard about the Aichi target. The Aichi target was set, I forget now exactly when, but maybe 10 years ago. And the target was that we need to cover 17% of the land surface of the earth under protected areas, 10% under of the oceans under protected area systems. Okay. Now, all of a sudden, now these targets are being changed now, and there is a report by somebody called Waldron and a huge group of about 100 scientists, which are calling for a 30% protected area network, both on land and in ocean. Now, from the Indian perspective, we need to ask, is this something realistic? Is it something that's feasible? Is it something that's possible for us to achieve? Less than 20% of our land surface is under the control of the forest department. And, if you take all the reserve forests in the country, the PAs, the national parks, sanctuaries, everything, it will not come to more than 18 or 19%. Okay. So in one sense, we have achieved the Aichi target, but going to 30% for us is impossible. And that's the point that I made, that we have to be careful and more nuanced. Because what does this mean when you say no-go areas? You know, a very large section of society, especially indigenous people, will be disadvantaged. So I call for a more inclusive landscape scale planning. And the landscape scale planning part of it is something that I have been propagating for the last several years now. And in the National Wildlife Action Plan, written a few years ago, I put in the concept of sustainable landscapes, where you have protected areas nested within the larger landscape, where you have private lands, you have a mosaic of all kinds of land use patterns, revenue lands, private lands, settlements, and so on and so forth. And there have to be incentives for people to maintain biodiversity-friendly land use. Because, see, given climate change, a host of plant and animal species are going to migrate. And in order to adapt, in which direction they're going to go, you and I can't really document for every single species. It's impossible. Very broadly, we know that species will migrate from lower elevation to higher elevation in mountain regions, in response to changing temperature. But then rainfall is going to change in very complex ways. So the best bet, or the insurance that we have to build resilience, is simply to ensure that we have landscapes with connectivity. And that connectivity can only come with the participation of local communities, private landowners, and we have to move away from a purely PA-centric model to a landscape scale model, which is inclusive of people's needs. And that's the best bet that we have for building resilience of biodiversity to climate change. The last part that what I will mention here is that this also calls for rationalizing the boundaries of our PAs. 15 or 20 years ago, I used to talk about the need to rationalize boundaries of PAs, under a changing climate, and people didn't understand this concept. So I said, for instance, in Himachal, when I went to Himachal, that we need to take more areas above at higher elevations where there are hardly anybody, or there is no settlement, and give up areas which are at lower elevation where you have thousands of people. And we actually help rationalize the boundaries of Himachal to the benefit of building climate resilience. And at that time, many people opposed it, but people had not heard about climate change at that time. The last part is about resilience of our forests. See, we sometimes think that, of course, diversity is important, but we should not make the mistake that it's only the diverse forest or the evergreen forest that will be resilient to climate change. The long-term research that Mahesh referred to, 30 years of work that we have done in Mudumalai with our permanent plots. It's about 32 years now that we have set up these plots. We find that tropical dry forests actually have very great resilience, both in terms of holding on to the number of species, as well as in terms of increasing carbon stocks. In spite of changes in temperature, big droughts that we have experienced, fire, and invasive species. You have had all the disturbances associated with climate change that you can ever list out in our big plot here. And yet the forest has been resilient. So let us also pay a lot of attention to our tropical dry forest systems, which are relatively species poor, but I think they show greater resilience perhaps. And it's really in the more diverse forests that are actually losing species. We have set up a number of 1 hectare plots across a rainfall gradient, and those are the ones that are actually losing species. So with that, I see the director of WII is, I think he's managed to link up. Hello, and I'll end here. And thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sukumar, for those really interesting and valuable perspectives. So at this point, we'll switch to our next speaker, Dr. Deepak Barua from IISER Pune. Deepak is an eco-physiologist who has worked extensively on plant responses to thermal and water stress. So that is, how do plants respond to high temperatures, droughts, and things like that. And what Deepak will do is give us perspective on the potential impacts of climate change on vegetation in the country. So with that, Deepak, I'll hand it over to you. You're muted, Deepak, so you may need to unmute. Can I unmute you?
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. Okay, you can see my screen?
Yeah, we can see you, Deepak. Go
Okay,
ahead.
great, thanks. Okay, thanks, Dr. Sukumar and Jagdish and Mahesh. I'm going to talk a little bit again in this short 10 minutes that I have about plant tolerance to extreme temperatures and very low water availability. And its implications for tropical forests in response to climate change. So shown here is a view of Earth's global temperatures. This is from 2018, and we've been breaking all records in terms of the temperatures and intensity of droughts over the last decade, in not just globally, but also here in India. This is from 2016, where we hit the highest temperatures ever recorded in India and Rajasthan. And in addition to high temperatures, we also have severe deficiencies in water availability, both in terms of meteorological and hydrological drought. Now, one of the consequences of this shown here is for temperature, is that with a change in the mean temperatures, what we often tend to neglect is that the probability of occurrence of extreme temperatures also increases dramatically. So shown here in the yellow. Now, I think unless you're a hardcore Trump supporter, everybody kind of agrees that global warming is kind of unequivocal now. The frequency and severity of extreme climatic events, both in terms of extreme temperatures and droughts, is predicted to increase in future climates. Both water and temperature play a major role in determining plant growth, survival, and persistence, and ultimately determining the distribution of species. And most models predict major damage to forests globally in the next century, given current climatic trajectories. And we are already observing a lot of this, which indicates that this forest decline is already well underway. So extinction of tree species by the effects of extreme drought and high temperatures will result in changes in community structure and also in terms of ecosystem function. And from this point of view, it's essential to understand the vulnerability of different species to extreme temperatures and drought. And currently, our understanding of how different tropical species, plant functional types, and communities vary with respect to their tolerance to drought and temperature is very limited. This is true of most tropical species, and particularly so from an Indian point of view in terms of the Indian tropical trees. So I quickly, 2, 3, or 4 slides, I want to go through some of what we do know about tolerance to both droughts and extreme temperature. So shown on the map on the top panel over here is a list of sites where we have a fairly good understanding of community level vulnerability to drought. So what you can see here is that in the tropics, a lot of the work is coming from South America, South and Central America, a little bit from Australia, and some studies in Southeast Asia, almost nothing from India and the African continent. So what we do know from these different studies is that in terms of tropical forests, the tropical forests hydraulic tolerance to drought, measured as hydraulic safety margins, is higher in sites which are wetter. So drier sites tend to be more vulnerable to drought. They are more resistant to drought, but also face more negative soil water potentials and overall tend to be less safe than wetter forests. But as Dr. Sukumar mentioned, for the dry tropical forest that he's studying, drier sites do tend to have a greater diversity of hydraulic safety margins, and it's believed that this might result in greater overall resilience of these systems to drought. As I was telling you, there's very little work in terms of actually understanding the eco-physiology of drought in Indian tropical forests. This is one of the studies that one of my PhD students did, where he compared hydraulic safety margins for two sites one in the northern Western Ghats and another in the central Western Ghats, which have very different rainfall regimes. And what we see is that there is a large variation in vulnerability to drought in these Indian tropical trees. Similar and actually a worse story in terms of our understanding of temperature tolerance. So how different tropical trees are going to respond to extreme temperatures that they might face in future climates. Again, you can see the sites where this has been studied is shown here in this map. A bunch of studies in South America, Africa, and Australia, and very little from other parts of the tropics. Again, there is some work that we have started in terms of trying to understand the temperature tolerance of Indian tropical trees, and shown here is 40 species commonly found in the northern Western Ghats, and the extreme temperatures, the high temperatures that they can tolerate. And I put this in the context here of the kinds of temperatures they normally experience in their natural environment. So you can see that the highest temperatures ever recorded in this region in the last 10 years is air temperatures is somewhere around 42 degrees centigrade. Most of these 40 species that we studied have temperature tolerances where they can maintain leaf function, which is significantly higher than the maximum air temperatures that they experience. But also need to keep in mind that leaf temperatures can be very different from air temperatures, especially under conditions where water is limiting, which can lead them to be 5 to 10 degrees higher than air temperatures, well within the realm of what these species normally see in their environment. So I'm going to quickly just sum this up, that tropical trees that we studied from India are close to their upper thermal limits, similar to what we have seen in other parts of the world. Interestingly, this temperature tolerance was different between evergreen and deciduous trees, and was related to leaf functional traits and photosynthetic rates in these trees. These imply that deciduous and fast-growing species may be more negatively affected by increased temperatures and possibly also drought. And such effects might lead to directional changes in species composition in these dry forests that where we studied these species from. And these are also important because such directional changes with respect to plant functional traits imply that such changes in species composition could further feed back into exacerbating future climate. So I'm going to end here with this last slide. When Jagdish asked me to speak in this webinar, my first thought was that I'm a little bit of an outlier here because what I study actually doesn't even come into this slide, or might come into the first part, where we're trying to understand the effect of climate, drought, and temperature effects on particular species. But this is possibly going to lead to shifted composition in forest communities, change the diversity, the composition, structure, the functional traits, distribution ranges of these different species, which is likely to then play an important effect in ecosystem processes like carbon stocks, hydrological function, nutrient cycling, etc. So just ending with this slide here, also highlighting that we have a long way to go in our understanding of going from the ecophysiology of these tree species to how it's going to affect changes in the communities and ultimately affect ecosystem processes and services. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Deepak. Thanks for that eco-physiological perspective on how plants respond to climate change. We'll obviously come back to this during the Q&A. I'm sure people have questions. But before that, we'll move to our last speaker. And it is a pleasure for me to introduce our last speaker, Dr. Dhananjay Mohan. Dr. Mohan is a member of the 1988 batch, if I'm not mistaken, of the Indian Forest Service, and he has served as the Principal Chief Conservator of Forests, Planning and Financial Management, and Chairman of the State Biodiversity Board in Uttarakhand. He is currently the Director of the Wildlife Institute of India, and essentially he'll be talking to us about the impacts of climate change from a forest and wildlife management perspective. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Dr. Mohan.
Thank you, Dr. Mahesh. I'll just, I have a few slides, so I'll share them. But before that, let me thank my old friend, Dr. Jagdish Krishna Swami, for having invited me on this. I'm no expert on climate change or adaptation or mitigation, but definitely this is the burning topic, and much has to happen on ground forest and wildlife management to basically do something positive about the adaptation and mitigation. So I'll just share this. Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, I don't have any primary research to back what I'm going to say. It's largely from the various documents that we practice, that we use, and of course, from the literature. And I actually chanced upon something very, very interesting, which is very recent, and I'll heavily bank upon that publication, which gives a new perspective to the whole idea of climate change adaptation and mitigation. So just to begin with, talking about the impacts of wildlife due to climate change. These are some of the very well-known things, but just to reiterate, range shifts, range expansion, range contractions, and they become even more, I would say, scary when we talk about mountain ecosystems. And in India, whenever we talk about climate change, I think Himalayas are the ones which seem to be getting affected most and are likely to face the maximum brunt. Then, of course, extreme events like floods, droughts, heat waves, fire, they all impact wildlife. And I think Dr. Jagdish gave some visuals to give us an idea about how extreme they can be. Changes in phenology, resource availability, disease emergence. I think when we talk about changes in phenology and some of the fauna getting out of sync with the changes, that can be disastrous for their survival. And disease emergence, I think one of the biggest example being quoted is about malaria climbing up the altitude, getting into areas where it was not known from, which is actually considered to be one of the biggest killers for at least the bird life. So these are all going to affect the biodiversity around us in a big way. And I think whatever targets we are setting, it's very hard to meet that. Dr. Sukumar mentioned about IKE target 11, 17% of area under terrestrial PAs and another 10% under marine PAs. Of course, when they say PAs, it is the IUCN PAs, not our Wildlife Protection Act protected areas. And we might be able to reach these, but the moment we talk about 30%, I think we'll be way off. So, of course, it's easier said than done that the ultimate solution is to shift to sustainable lifestyles. But as I said, it's easier said than done. But yes, that should be the goal. That should be the overarching aim. So, of course, one of the biggest focus on whole climate change adaptation and mitigation is about ecosystem restoration. And I think all the countries across the globe have been talking about it. And I think very symbolic that the United Nations have declared the next decade as UN decade for ecosystem restoration. So there are ambitious targets at various levels, and large-scale ecosystem restoration is being planned. Of course, I must say one point here that very often this restoration is considered to be analogous to or similar to tree planting, which actually may not be the right strategy at many places. And that is what I'm going to elaborate further a little later. But I think by and large, most of the countries are now accepting this, that ecosystem restoration is going to be the key for dealing with climate change and the way forward, basically. So what I was mentioning right in the beginning, I chanced upon this very interesting paper, Global Priorities for Restoration. And this is very recent, just a couple of weeks back it was published in Nature. And it gives a wonderful perspective, because it just not talks about ecosystem restoration in isolation. It talks about multiple benefits. It doesn't talk only about climate change. It talks about biodiversity, conservation, costs. That's very important, because whenever we give a suggestion, the costs become extremely important. And a suggestion, howsoever good it may be, if it is not feasible financially, it may not come through. So looking at all these, it tried to balance all these things and came up with a priority classification of the whole world. And so it doesn't just talk about tree planting or something like that. I mean, it talks about retaining natural ecosystem within the landscapes. And again, what Dr. Sukumar said, it has to be a landscape approach, wherein all kinds of land uses, starting from conservation to restoration to improved use of agricultural lands. I mean, agriculture is also extremely important land use. And in climate change, I think that also has an extremely important role to play in adaptation and mitigation. So there have to be practices which change our present style of agriculture to a more sustainable model. And that is how it can actually, deal with some of the issues raised, which arise because of climate change. And some of the very key things that come out in this publication is that restoration of about 30% of converted lands in priority areas would lead to such high gains. I mean, it's not that the restoration or efforts have to be done all over uniformly. So what it has wonderfully, in a very nice manner, it has done is to prioritize areas. And some of the figures are really very pleasing, that if you can concentrate your effort on these priority areas, maybe with a smaller coverage on the globe, you can get returns which are really phenomenal. Of course, as I always say, it is not just have to be a forest focused approach. It has to be a target. It has to be something which looks at all the biomes. It is not just the forested biome, because mostly whenever we talk about climate change mitigation, we are only talking about reforesting, afforesting, and tree planting, that kind of an approach. I mean, just to give an example, the alpine areas in the Himalayas, I think they are one of the biggest carbon sinks. And if your practices can somehow help in conservation of these alpine areas in the Himalayas, that I think will contribute maybe much more than tree planting in certain areas. So, and of course, everything has to synergize when we deal with climate change. In fact, that is the biggest challenge, to bring all the players together. In fact, unfortunately, we've been all through these decades, we've been working in compartments. When I work in the government, I see that happening. People are very protective about their turf. Various departments, they don't gel together. But climate change is something which is cross-cutting. In fact, most of the climate action plans, they also have not been able to deliver to the extent required because of these compartmentalization of various facets of the government. So in fact, this map, before I move into my last slide, this map is again from the same publication, which prioritizes various areas. The top 5%, which are in red, are the ones where the restoration activity will give the maximum dividends when it comes to climate change mitigation. And as we can see, India and much of South Asia, Southeast Asia is one of the priority areas. Same goes true for much of the tropical world. But these are the areas where much of the effort has to concentrate. And of course, through this, I think they have a great database on this prioritization, which the countries can use for prioritizing areas into various action plans that they go into. I mean, these are some examples which actually steer the management for climate change mitigation. The states have their own action plans on climate change. And most importantly, when we talk about our natural areas, be it the protected areas or sanctuaries, national parks, or the conservation or community reserves, or other reserve forests, again, Dr. Sukumar talked about them. I mean, some 18-19% of area, wherein perhaps it's relatively easier to bring about the change. I mean, it's not so easy to bring about the change in areas which are controlled directly by human beings. They're completely man-modified landscapes, because there the priorities are actually completely governed by the human need. So, I mean, you ask somebody to change their agricultural practices, it's not going to happen so quickly. But in this 18-19% area of our country, which is largely governed through these documents, the National Working Plan Code or the Management Planning Code, which actually guide and steer the management of these areas. So these are the documents which need to integrate the various prioritized areas and the strategies. The National Working Plan Code does talk about climate change mitigation, but it's extremely generic and doesn't really help too much on the ground. And I must say that, of course, this area is evolving, and even 6 years is a long time. 2014, I think, is a little outdated. And I think some timely interventions are required so that these documents can help in developing working plans or management plans which are much more effective in dealing with climate change adaptation and mitigation. So I'll end here. I just wanted to give an overall perspective how management is done and how it can be certain adaptations can be and mitigatory strategies can be undertaken. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Mohan, and actually all the speakers. Thank you for all your wonderful insights. I'm going to, at this point, sort of open up the floor for discussions and questions. And I'm just going to start off with a couple of questions that sort of arose from the points that were made during the during the course of your presentations. And both Dr. Mohan and Dr. Sukumar raised this point about the need to move away or to step back and think of planning at a landscape level, right? Which I think is a very good strategy. But Dr. Mohan, as you also mentioned, in the past, government agencies have always been working in silos. And in order to, get this, we can plan, but in order to translate it effectively in the ground, it requires organizations to come and work together. And I was just wondering if both you and Dr. Sukumar have any insights about how that might actually be done. What are the challenges we face? Of course, there are obvious challenges in terms of, breaking the silos, but are there any things that we can do to facilitate this crosstalk between institutions in the face of climate change?
Well, may I?
Sure, please. Yeah.
I think a basic issue, because for moving over to the Wildlife Institute of India, I got an opportunity to work as PCCF, planning and financial management. Now, this is a position wherein I was not really dealing with wildlife matters per se, but this gave me an opportunity to actually interact with the government on a very, very regular basis, because I was looking at the planning and financial management of the forest department, and in Uttarakhand, it's a very big department. So I was continuously interacting with the various echelons of the government. Now, the problem is whenever we talk about climate change, ecosystem restoration, everybody now immediately considers it to be a baby of forest department. And I think that is where the problem is. It has to be owned up by the government. Now, easier said than done again. And we have bureaucratic inertia of decades. So, but I think this is where that sensitivity has to be brought in. And somehow if the government can own up these things, now these mechanisms can actually flow from the highest level from Government of India to the states. And things are happening, although maybe not at the desired pace, so that the government owns it up, and forests and wildlife is only looked at as a component of the whole strategy. Because when we talk about landscapes, agriculture is a huge area, grazing lands, even urban areas. So it has to be a whole lot of departments working together. Even the climate action plans are again being developed by the forest departments. So they are, that ownership is lacking. See, it's fine, the forest department can work and give prescriptions for that 18-19% of area. But the moment you start, you have to go beyond that. The ownership has to be at a different level. So that is the major change that needs to be brought in. I mean, it will have to happen. Only thing is how fast. And that is where I think some directives and some exposure and some sensitization may be required.
Thanks, Dr. Mohan. Professor Sukumar, would you like to add anything here?
Yeah, certainly. So thanks. In fact, both Dr. Dhananjay Mohan and I sit on the Apex Conservation whatever body in the country. And in the past, several occasions, I've been trying to bring up this issue of the need for a paradigm shift in our conservation priorities and our conservation outlook, let me put it that way. Trying to promote the landscape approach, which is more inclusive. But what happens is that we are still stuck in the rut of what I would say the rut of trying to increase what, the PA, the protected area rut. And the general, discussions, whatever that comes up, the general demands that come from a section of the conservation society or even from within the forest departments and so on, is to just go on increasing the area under protected areas network. Okay. So whether it's a sanctuary or whether it is a tiger reserve, even if a few tigers appear in some territorial forest divisions, there is a demand to declare that as a tiger reserve because a huge pot of money is available for under the National Tiger Conservation Authority, which is not available elsewhere. I think it's very important for us to get together and ask for a paradigm shift, because something that is, I think, much more suited to the Indian national circumstances is the landscape approach. I think if you look at, I think India has done extremely well in terms of setting up a network of protected areas. We have done extremely well. I will not agree with a section which says that, we are doing very badly. In terms of our, many of our wildlife species, they have increased in numbers, not decreased, or at least held their ground by and large. There would still be critical species and so on and so forth, the broader biodiversity, which I will not get into right now. But the way to save the broader biodiversity is really now moving into a landscape approach. And that landscape approach essentially means that control over land and decision-making has to be shared by different wings in the administration. That includes forest department, certainly, but it also includes revenue departments and various wings of the revenue department, including agriculture. And very often I see a great reluctance to do that. All right. So I think that is really a stumbling block. So we are still stuck in this rut. There's a call, even the last meeting of the NPWL, there's a call for, let us now increase the area under the national parks and sanctuaries or tiger reserves. We have achieved our 5% target in terms of, I remember 30 years ago, the demand was that, and very prominent conservationists who I will not name here, said that let us achieve a 5% target and let us leave the rest of the 95% for development. We are fine with that. We will hold on to 5% national parks and sanctuaries, rest 95% let development take place. We have reached 95%. We have reached 5%. And we have not only reached 5%, I would say we have gone much beyond that, because we now have the ecologically sensitive zone notifications, which is again, in many cases, they're larger than the area of the national park or the wildlife sanctuary. So effectively 10%. Then you add to that an additional 12, 13, 14%, which is under reserve forest, which is under government control and protected. You just can't give away under Forest Conservation Act. There are a number of other laws. We are effectively protecting something like, I would say, certainly more than 20% of the land area of the country. But the important thing is to integrate this now and not be focused too much on, just a tiger or an elephant or whatever, but look at the broader biodiversity perspective. Because, for species to adapt, You and I really can't do anything about it when there are hundreds of thousands of species that need to adapt. They will move, they have to migrate, they have to disperse, they have to adapt. There will be compositional changes, the kind of changes that Deepak Barua just mentioned, they will happen whether you like it or not. Okay, and whatever will be left after 50 years or 100 years will be left. So the only way to adapt and to build a certain kind of resilience is to take a landscape approach. And we need to move towards that pretty quickly. So I would again appeal to Dr. Dhananjay Mohan that we should join forces and try to bring about this paradigm shift in our outlook, in our thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sukma, and thank you, Dr. Dhananjay Mohan. And this is very interesting because this is a perspective that has, been sort of reflected even in some of the earlier webinars that we had, like for example, the biodiversity and ecosystem service perspective. The idea that we need to look at landscapes, as mosaic landscapes that provide different kinds of services, functions, and contribute to resilience and of both human societies and natural communities. And I don't know, let's hope that the national mission can help in sort of bringing about these linkages between different agencies that are needed in order to be able to achieve this. So I'm just going to take some questions from I have a list of questions that have been asked from the audience. I'm just, this one's for you, Jagdish. You can take it, and Deepak, if you want to answer, that's fine too. There's a question from Ghazala, Dr. Ghazala Shehbudin, and she asks, is there any research yet on the effect of species diversity on some of the ecosystem functions mentioned, such as hydrological services or climate control? In the Western Himalaya, for example, several scholars and local people believe that the multi-species deciduous forests offer more resilience in comparison to the tree pine dominated systems in the middle elevations. Would you like to comment on that, the linkages between biodiversity and ecosystem resilience?
Yeah, I'll just
start with you, Deepak. Yeah, sorry, Jagdish. Yeah,
okay. And then Deepak can add to this. We have very little information on the two things that trees can do when they are subjected to moisture stress, or also temperature induced moisture stress, as is happening in the Western Himalayas. I mean, if you are too conservative in shutting down photosynthesis in order to prevent hydraulic failure, then you could eventually that could result in carbon starvation because you're not photosynthesizing enough, and then if you are very liberal as a species, let's say, in terms of continuing to photosynthesize even when there is possibility of moisture stress, then you run the risk of hydraulic failure. So it's between carbon starvation and hydraulic failure. These are the twin challenges that different species face. And we really don't have a very good idea of how temperature and moisture interact in terms of variables related to plant functional traits across species, not just for the Himalayas, even for other types of forests. I think the work that Deepak is doing, at least on the temperature side of the things, is very important. And we know that, for example, cheer pine and oak respond very differently to drought. So so one thing I would like to mention is 1998-99, there was a very severe El Nino year. We had there was hardly any rain in the post-monsoon season in the Western Himalayas, and the oak forests were particularly hit hard, and there was also some level of defoliation. The leaf water potentials actually showed that oak forests are particularly vulnerable to reduction in post-monsoonal rainfall during the dry season when temperatures are also rising. So that is the type of information actually that we need for a variety of species. So whereas comparing cheer pine and oak in the Western Himalayas will be very important. Similarly, for other forested regions, we need to have other candidate species that need to be compared in terms of responses. So this is an area, it's a knowledge gap. So over to Deepak.
Thanks, Jagdish. Deepak, would you like to answer?
Okay. Thanks, Jagdish. I don't have a specific answer to the question that Ghazala has asked, but in general, it is believed that greater diversity, both in terms of species and also in terms of traits, does lead to greater resilience response to how events, both temperature and for drought. For example, greater diversity of hydraulic traits has been shown in a global study to be very closely linked to how quickly these systems bounce back after a drought event. So not specifically for the systems that the question was asked, but greater diversity, I do believe in general should lead to better resilience, greater resilience.
Thanks, Deepak. And just following on that, I'd like to come to the question for you and Dr. Sukumar. Both of you talked about dry forests, and there were some contrasting results there where Dr. Sukumar, based on 30 years, found that dry forests were more resilient. And I think you sort of alluded to that in your talk too, that even they may be they may have trees that are susceptible. They usually have a greater diversity of traits, so possibly conferring some kind of resistance to them. And both the results from both studies seem to suggest that the wet forests are more vulnerable. And so do you think we should be focusing efforts on wet forests? Because historically, dry forests are the ones that have got the short end of the stick anyway. And we've sort of ignored our dry forests, and these have been changed, and we've lost most of our dry forests. But do you think there's a need to change that, or we just stick with the focus on wet forests because they're more resilient? Or they're likely to be less resilient? I mean, I'm playing the devil's advocate here. So
Dr. Sukumar, I'll let you go ahead and start.
No, Deepak, no, I'll let you answer and then I'll come back.
So Mahesh, actually the results that I showed was a meta-analysis that a PhD student of mine did. Earlier, it was thought that within the tropics, at least, there was not much difference in vulnerability to drought. But his results from more recently contradicts this earlier study from 2012, suggests actually that the wet forests are safer. That's not what you said. So they are actually safer in terms of hydraulic safety margins. They're more sensitive to drought, but they also tend to have higher safety margins. They don't experience water potentials which are close to negative potential that will ultimately lead to catastrophic hydraulic failure. So in that sense, they're safer. The dry forests actually are more susceptible according to this meta-analysis. And there's, I think, a long way to go from a meta-analysis result like that to actually projecting what's going to happen, though. That caveat is always there, right?
Okay.
But the second part of your question, should we focus more on the wet forests? I can, at least from the point of view of temperature, would like to mention that very little is known. And the more we are finding out, it does seem to indicate that these wet forests are also going to be experiencing temperatures which will ultimately lead to loss of leaf eco-physiological function and ultimately possibly mortality, also in interaction with water availability, of course. So I think we don't understand enough about the wet forests. We do need more work. And the obvious bit, of course, that these systems do tend to be more diverse. Yeah, my two little bits. Dr. Sukumar, I'll let you.
Okay.
Thanks, Deepak. Yeah.
I think Deepak and I, we work at sort of very different scales. So my data, it's all empirical. It comes from permanent forest plots set up across a rainfall gradient here in Mudumalai, which is where I am right now. And the rainfall gradient goes from 800 millimeters to 1800 millimeters, within a short distance of about 50 kilometers or so. And what we have been finding with these smaller plots, I mean, the first thing I should say is that the large plot that we have, the 50-hectare plot, is located right bang in the middle of Mudumalai. So it's the medium rainfall area. And that over a period of 32 years or 33 years now that we have been monitoring, it has not lost any species. It has actually gained a few species, and it has the total carbon stock has gone up, by a reasonable amount. In spite of droughts, fire, invasive plants, you name it, elephants coming and knocking over the trees, it's all happened. In spite of that, that forest has held on. Okay, with greater diversity than in 1988, with greater carbon stocks than in 1988. Okay, but if you look across the rainfall gradient, this is something we don't fully understand, and that is that what we are actually finding is that the species loss. Only talking about species loss. We are still looking at other aspects, carbon stocks and so on. The species loss has actually been greater on the western part, the wetter part, and there have been more gains on the eastern part, the drier part. So this is empirical. Okay, this is observational. Now causation is something that I just will not be able to explain. I don't know. What has actually happened over time. Had there been subtle changes in rainfall in the western part versus the eastern part? There were reports about a decade ago that the southwestern Ghats, if you look at reports that have published papers from IITM Pune, they talk about a decline in rainfall in the southern Western Ghats on the western part. Okay, could that have played a role? Could that have extended into our area? We're not very sure as yet. So I can't give you a straightforward answer, but empirically, these are plots that have been set up across a strong rainfall gradient. The wetter forests have lost more diversity. They have fewer species compared to the eastern areas, which have gained or whatever have remained the same as previously. The second part of your question: where do we focus on? I think we need to focus on all forests. I think we need to keep the wet forest because of the diversity, that's the sheer diversity. Okay, we need to maintain that diversity in the wetter forests. And the only point I'm trying to make is don't write off the dry forests, because the dry forest, the savannas, you are a savanna expert. People say it's all wasteland, it's all scrub, it is all, it doesn't matter. Let's go and convert all this. And Dr. Dhananjay Mohan also mentioned this, that we should not focus on tree planting. See, we have converted many of the savannas, just planted trees in savannas that should remain as savannas or as grasslands, for instance. So all that I'm saying is the dry forest, let's not write it off. It has shown great resilience in terms of carbon stocks, at least. So at least from that point of view. And from global studies that grasslands and savannas play a great role as a storehouse of carbon, which is also very important in climate mitigation. Okay, so let's focus on all forests and give equal importance to everything. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Sippama. Yeah, I fully agree with you. And this sort of answers some of the questions that some people have raised in the Q&A box, like a question by Sarika relating to unplanned ecological restoration and how that's responsible for biodiversity loss and climate change. I think at some level, many of the speakers have addressed it. Dr. Dhananjay Mohan spoke about it early on, and you've covered it here, that many of these systems have their carbon stocks underground, and we shouldn't be planting trees in grasslands and savannas because neither does it help restore those ecosystems, and in fact, it's a form of degradation. So some more questions. Let me see, there's a whole bunch of questions. I'm not sure we'll be able to get to them all, but this one's for you. Well, actually, this is a question that if Roxy was here, would have been able to answer it. But since he's not, I will just throw it out. If either Jagdish or Dr. Sukma, Professor Sukma, if you can answer this, that'll be great, or else we can respond by email. How robust and, this is from Prabhakar Bhatt, how robust and accurate are the climate change models and their projections that are used by Indian scientists? Were the climate change projections for India able to predict rainfall extremes that are being experienced in India these years?
I'll just
Jagdish, you want to start with that? I'll give it to you. Yeah.
So, since the early 1950s, the actual Indian monsoon, that is from observations, we have seen a low to moderate decline in the overall Indian monsoon. And this has not been captured adequately by climate models. And so this has been an active area of research and challenge for climate scientists, and they are getting better at it. So because you would want climate models to have been able to predict this observed decline in the Indian monsoon. So while that has been a bit of a puzzle, and of course there are the work of Roxy and many others who would have been far more capable of answering this question in much greater detail. As our seas are warming up, the thermal contrast between the seas and the land mass has also been declining, and which is a major driving force of the Indian monsoon. So that is one of the factors that's probably causing the weakening of the Indian monsoon. And there are other scientists who say that this is part of natural variability, and it could overturn, and it could move into another trajectory. But generally, this is one issue. At the same time, we have seen a lot of increase in spatial variability of the monsoon, and the frequency of more intense rain. And we have seen examples of over 900 millimeters in a single day in Mumbai, and some years back we have had we've seen the devastating floods in Hyderabad just a few days back. Chennai got 225 just in a day and a half a few years back. So clearly we are seeing evidence of very high intensity rains. Now this is one part of climate change model projections that is being borne out by real data. So climate change is supposed to accelerate the hydrologic system, and there's going to be also the capacity of the atmosphere to store and transform large quantities of moisture quickly into intense rain. That has happened and seems to be happening. So while some parts of the monsoon behavior are not being explained adequately by the climate models as of now, but other aspects such as the increase in extreme events is definitely in consonance with what climate models are telling us about these changes. So that's basically my answer to that part. And if Dr. Sukumar would like to add to that, please.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, all that I will say is that variability and extreme rainfall events and so on is one part of the of the story. The second part is the spatially are we able to predict? You take Western Ghats, you take the Eastern Ghats, you take peninsular India, you take the northwest of the country, you take the northeast of the country, you take central India. How good the models are in trying to project how the monsoon will play out, in these regions over a period of time, because all India monsoon average or something is meaningless essentially, to somebody who's living in a region where the monsoon is declining or whatever, or maybe increasing, and so on. So I think that's where the challenges are. And from the old GCM, the general circulation models, the crude models, people have started with the statistical downscaling, the regional models and so on are now being used. But I still think there are surprises thrown out. There is a Japanese model that seemed to closely match the observed monsoon over the past 100 years or whatever. And that has very dire predictions, okay, in terms of monsoon. But once that model comes out, it says that the Western Ghats will, wherever you have orography, the monsoon will decline. And the paper comes out, and a few years later, you have torrential rainfall along the Western Ghats. So it's very, very difficult to say. So I think neither of us are really climate scientists in that. Therefore, I don't really think that we can do justice to that topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Sukumar. So I have one question for Dr. Dhananjay Mohan. Given that you've been in the field and in the government working in the Forest Department for so long, we're just wondering what thoughts if you had about conserving wildlife in a changing climate. As Professor Sukumar said, right, we need to think in terms of the future, and areas that are currently suitable may not be suitable. Are there plans afoot to take into account the effects of climate change on biodiversity, or are there things you suggest that need to be done from an institutional and government perspective for us to do this?
I think such thoughts are still very much in infancy, and we are still following the traditional model of protecting our biodiversity, the protected areas. The protection is the primary thing. There is a talk about climate change, all right, but for example, in the mountain areas, I mean, wherever there are ridge lines, for example, which become vulnerable, and there is a possibility of species getting locally extinct. I don't think there is much thought in that direction, which needs to be initiated, and that's precisely what our state climate action plans need to address. Because otherwise, as I said, even our working plan code doesn't address it well. 2014, when our understanding was poor. So I would say that nothing much has really been initiated except for some general talk about it. But I think now things have to be done very rapidly. The climate change threat is for real, and we have to deal with it. I don't know how quickly we can respond to that. But right now, I would say that our management is still not quite geared up to deal with the climate change, and climate action plans also perhaps have to get into a new new avatar very quickly to address these things. And the way things are evolving, of course, I would say that many of the things are still not very clear as to what steps need to be taken on the ground, and that is perhaps what is limiting. So I would say that it's yet to properly take off, and that's a worry, surely a worry.
Thanks.
Mahesh, can I make just a brief
Please,
comment on this?
please.
Yeah. Earlier, what I said about landscapes, I think the only way we can achieve this in our country with a very large human population is that we have a meaningful participation by local communities and people. Okay, I don't think we can achieve it otherwise. Because when we talk about a host of plant and animal species, by a host I mean everything. Hundreds of thousands of species will have to adapt. They'll have to move. They have to shift their ranges. This can only happen through biodiversity-friendly land use patterns that people are able to maintain. So by definition, you will have to include areas where you are not seen as taking over people's lands, for the sake of wildlife conservation or whatever, which is the threat today that a lot of people have, and real, real concerns that people have. But you really need to set up a system of rewards and incentives for people who maintain biodiversity-friendly land use in areas where you want species to adapt, the broader biodiversity to adapt. And that's the only part that we have. We have 1.3 billion people. It's going to grow to 1.5 or 1.6 billion people, and species are going to shift, and they're going to shift into private lands so they have to eventually disperse, move through people's lands, over a period of years or decades or whatever. I'm not just talking about the elephant or the tiger. I'm talking about the broader biodiversity. And therefore, land use planning is very important. And this can only be achieved with meaningful people's participation, which is not happening. It's happening on a small scale here and there, but it has to really be institutionalized into our... See, today the dominant force in our country in terms of conservation is what we call wildlife planning. That wildlife has to become a greater, broader biodiversity, and we need to move in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sukumar. Actually, that was a very, very timely response, because there's a whole load of questions in the Q&A relating to social issues, land tenure, how do you actually involve people, and how do you ensure that indigenous practices are not corroded and so on. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go into all of those questions during the webinar because we are running out of time. But we'll try and respond to these offline. But I'm glad that you touched upon this issue of the need to involve local communities, which I fully agree is essential to making any of these plans that we have, whether at the landscape level or not, actually be successful. Right, so we just have...
Mahesh, just wanted to add one more point. I mean, if we have to involve the communities, see, the gains have to be economic. They are not going to appreciate climate change, resilience or mitigation so much until unless the gains for them are economic. It's not going to really sail through when it comes to working on agricultural areas and all. So that has to be kept in mind all the time. So even though the ultimate aim may be climate change mitigation, but on the face of it, for people, it has to be some kind of an economic return. We may say organic farming or more sustainable farming, but it has to pay somehow to the people. Then only they will adapt. They can't just change because it's going to help mitigate climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what for majority of the people. So that's
Mahesh,
one point I just wanted to add. Yeah.
Mahesh,
Sure.
can I just slip in a sentence?
Please do, Jagdish.
Yeah, so I just want, even though most of our friends and colleagues have been focusing on forests, savannas, and so on, I would like to just mention that there are, riverscapes, wetlands, which are largely going to be, their fate and future is going to be governed by in some sense, human land use decisions, because they are all already multiple use. Rivers you can't conserve a river ecosystem without taking into account sustainable agriculture, capture fisheries, and this linkages to aquatic biodiversity. So I think a lot of the restoration debate also has to focus on ecosystems which are already human dominated, but they have a tremendous scope for certain forms of biodiversity, and they're going to play a critical role. So I think free-flowing rivers, for example, are largely flowing through human-dominated systems. Soon after they leave the high mountains, they're all flowing through agricultural areas, and ultimately are going all the way up to estuaries and deltas, where they contribute to marine biodiversity or aquatic productivity. So we have to, it's not just landscapes, but entire basins that we have to think in terms of land use planning and so on. So it's in some sense, it's a huge challenge that we really have to go. Thinking has to go beyond our existing protected real estate, and this whole debate of land sharing and land sparing, which is the terms used in Western conservation discourse. I think that's already happening in some sense. We just need to think about models that are going to work for us.
Mahesh, I'll also slip in a couple of sentences.
Sure.
Economics is going to be a central part of this. Economics is going to be a central part of it, without which we really cannot achieve this. The second point is that in our international negotiations, the issue of loss and damage, borne by developing countries, is a topic that has actually been very seriously discussed nowadays. Okay, and the concept of climate justice. In fact, IPCC, the assessment, I've been part of chapter 1, the framing chapter, and these are concepts that are coming very strongly into it. And therefore we have to, in our international negotiations, put it across to the countries that have done most of the damage on climate change with their greenhouse gas emissions, that put your money on the table, and that's the way that we'll be able to adapt. And okay, so there should be no compromises on that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Professor Sukumar. So we are almost out of time. So I'm just going to quickly synthesize a couple of points that I thought emerged from these great discussions that we've had. And one of them is the need to move away from small scale to larger scale landscape level perspectives that involve multiple ecosystem services, multiple organizations, and we need to start thinking of ways how we can actually achieve this. And at the core of this is, as some of the discussion towards the end highlighted, is involving people and local communities, and the net benefits to people must outweigh the costs. Irrespective of how these are calculated, whether economic or whatever people have, they must gain some benefits from it that exceeds the cost. And there was also this need to move beyond just wildlife and charismatic species to think of biodiversity in its entirety, which involves plants, animals, everything in all its varied forms. And and also think about rationalizing PAs and how we make our planning decisions in the light of potential future climate changes. Those are some of the points that I sort of noted down during these discussions. And we're almost at the end, but what I would like to do is sort of hand it back to each one of the speakers for a very quick recap, maybe a minute or so, about your thoughts on the biodiversity mission and how you think how it should go ahead and how it can achieve its goals and of helping us become climate resilient, so to speak. Jagdish, should I give it to you? I mean, it's a fairly broad ask, but just one thought would help. Yeah.
As I said, entrepreneurships. We really need to have, just like we have entrepreneurships for doing many things, startups they call them. We also need to invest in very creative entrepreneurships that link foresters with scientists, with local stakeholders and specialists in different fields, economists and sociologists, to really come up with a conservation and restoration model that is really resilient. It should last beyond the terms of a 3-year or a 5-year project with funding, and it should be really be in the long term. And I think that's where our efforts need to go in terms of fostering these partnerships.
Thanks, Jagdish. Professor Sukumar, any last thoughts?
I don't think so. I think I've spoken enough. So
okay, yeah. Fair enough. Deepak, you're muted, Deepak.
Great initiative. We have a long way to go, but this is a good start.
All right. Dr. Dhananjay Mohan.
I think the most important point is that this whole thing of climate change adaptation and mitigation is not something that is a matter of concern for a selected few, for the conservationists or for the foresters or the forest department. It has to be owned up by everyone, and most importantly by the governments as a whole. And I think initiation of a mission with biodiversity on the top of it is a very, very welcome step in this direction. I think it's like a wonderful thing to have a mission targeted at biodiversity. So I think things should look up, and we're very hopeful about it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'd like to, take a moment to thank all of you for coming in and, participating in this webinar. I, for one, really enjoyed the discussions and the talks that we've had. Just before we conclude, there are a couple of, again, housekeeping announcements I'd like to make. Like I said, we've tried and answered some of the questions that we could, given the time, but we still have a few questions that have remained unanswered, and we'll try and respond to your questions over email. If you still have questions that you would like answered by this panel, please do send an email to contact@biodiversitycollaborative.org. And we thank all of you for attending this webinar, as well as earlier webinars in the series. And in fact, this is the last webinar in this entire series. And before I sign off, we will also request for those of you who are on social media to follow the Biodiversity Collaborative on, it's on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And yeah, with that, I'd like to say thanks. And finally, once again, acknowledge the support that we've received from the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India for conducting these webinars. And with that, I'd say thank you. Thanks, everyone, both the speakers and the attendees. Thank you very much.